Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Hallie Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all. All right. Hello, listeners, and welcome back. Today, I'm talking to arguably the most successful pharmacist turned entrepreneur in our time. TJ Parker has quietly but radically changed how Americans get their healthcare. He was the co-founder and CEO of PillPack, the company that reimagined the pharmacy experience and eventually became the backbone of Amazon Pharmacy after Amazon acquired PillPack for $1 billion. Now he's a general partner at Matrix and recently helped start a new company with his former co-founder. It's called General Medicine, and they are aiming to make care as easy and transparent as ordering anything else online. TJ, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start at the beginning. You grew up in your family's pharmacy in, I believe, New Hampshire. Literally behind the counter. You've talked before about delivering medications to patients in your family car. What were some of your earliest observations about our healthcare system?
Yeah, so I worked at my dad's pharmacy starting at 16 or 17, initially behind the counter, and then pretty quickly realized I liked being the delivery boy, so kind of like the kid in It's a Wonderful Life. And, I think that was a super formative experience, right? I spent both the later years of high school and then early years of college delivering people their meds, and you saw just the same patterns of challenges that everyone had, right? Every Sunday night, filling their pillbox and trying to organize everything. Everyone had the same kind of Excel spreadsheet on their fridge with their medications like crossed out and highlighted. And it was clearly just a very complicated and frustrating experience was the main thing that I kept observing. And, I went off to pharmacy school it was 2006. And I think at the time was very interested in how do we fix these problems, but I didn't have a much more specific idea at that point. But it really was just observing this constantly frustrating and complicated experience for the customers.
You went to pharmacy school, I imagine, wanting to be a pharmacist and wanting to be the person that is running the whole shop and not just delivering the medications.
Yeah, I actually started school as a business major, and 2 years into that, realized that it would be much more helpful to have a technical background, a more specific education. And I knew pharmacy pretty well because I'd grown up in it and it was interesting to me. And so I would say I always had this ambition of melding the two. I don't think I had the dream of working behind the counter for a long period of time, but I would say that spending all that energy, both becoming a pharmacist, but also working in pharmacy was obviously super important and useful when it came to starting PillPack.
Do you still think of yourself or identify as a pharmacist?
I mostly make jokes when people ask me medical questions about how I'm a pharmacist, but my competency clinically has gone down as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I just go to ChatGPT and answer their question. I think I still know what I'm talking about.
I'm sure you still know more than the average person. So before we dive into your time at PillPack and talk about your new startup, which we will do, I want to step back and know what you think about some of the core structural problems that make healthcare feel so user hostile. And I say user hostile because everything that you've worked on to date has been all about making that user experience more pleasant. So I'm imagining that there's something at the core that, is the common thread through all of this.
Yeah, I think when you really zoom out, you realize that almost nothing in healthcare was designed with the actual end user in mind, right? Everything was either designed most often for a payer and what their sort of incentives are and their intentions are, for the clinician, for the other participants in the supply chain. Very few things were designed to make the actual end customer experience as good as it possibly can be. And obviously, when you're building anything in healthcare, you have to address all the constituents. You can't just kind of build and avoid. But I do think it's super important to understand what your hierarchy of importance is. And both at PillPack and General Medicine, the work we did at Amazon, we're always super clear that at the end of the day, the number one constituent is the end customer, and everything we do is to make their life better and easier. Obviously, there's a bunch of challenging incentives that are just baked into the system that you have to navigate around. And I think unlikely that you're going to totally fix some of those incentive issues. But I do think it's really powerful to be super clear that the thing you care about is making the end customer experience better.
Yeah. I mean, but when you started PillPack, that was like unheard of, right? Anyone that had something consumer facing was laughed out of the room. No one liked anything that was direct to consumer.
Yeah, I think it's like hard for folks that weren't there at the time to kind of imagine what that world was like, but it was really wacky to start a pharmacy startup, right? There wasn't like, there's dozens of them and all sorts of different permutations. But at the time, that was a really weird thing to do. Honestly, it probably worked out really well for us because it was wacky enough that it was novel, but it was definitely not a normal take or like a sort of standard thing to go do.
I always say like the newcomers can't imagine how gaslit we were at the time. It was crazy.
I mean, it was kind of nice because you were doing something original. There wasn't like 15 competitors doing slight variations of what you're doing. Like we were the only kind of interesting pharmacy in town. So that was kind of interesting and fun in its own way. Do
you thrive off of like proving people wrong?
That definitely was not a motivator like early in my career. I'd say, as my career has progressed, I have gotten more and more convicted that things like pricing and shopping are the linchpin to fix a bunch of these problems. And I think in that sense, yes. But it wasn't like the primary motivator as a 26-year-old when I started PillPack.
Yeah. I didn't realize you were only 26 when you started PillPack. What do you think are kind of the biggest blockers today and how that has changed from the biggest blockers when you were starting PillPack? I mean, we talked about just people not really believing in the consumer market, probably just less funding and less belief in that model. That's not a problem today, obviously. What are the biggest blockers today? Like regulation, misaligned incentives, like the legacy systems, or something totally different?
I mean, I think misaligned incentives is the largest overhang, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like if you really unpack a commercial payer's incentives, like it's care avoidance or lower cost site of care is really the only thing that is going to move the needle in sort of in-plan year costs for a commercial payer. So I think that's like the most fundamental issue in healthcare. I don't pretend that I have some kooky solves for that, but nothing that I'm actively working on. I think practically speaking, the challenges now are mostly technical, right? If you think about what we're trying to do at general medicine, the real ambition is for you to get a price up front and be able to transact like you do in any other retail category. And I think for the first time that is buildable. Like historically, that just hasn't been buildable, but it's still very difficult. And it's both technically difficult to do that. And then there are regulatory complexities that you layer on top of that, right? Like you can't mischarge a consumer for something out of pocket. You've got to go back and figure out how to either refund them or charge them more after the fact. And so there's sort of regulatory issues, but I would say generally that the current regulatory environment and the work that's been done over the last decade doesn't lay a lot of the groundwork for what we're trying to do. Like I do think it is now very achievable for you to elegantly pull a patient's full medical record. It's not like this thing that everyone has. You can do it today. Like we're doing it today at general medicine. You can get to real price quotes, both because of some of these open price files and AI and LLMs and like using all the available tools. And that is a byproduct of, 10 plus years of folks trying to make this data more accessible and useful.
But who doesn't want that? Is it the health plans that don't want this? Is it, I guess, PBMs? Like who are the kind of the old guard within healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, there's just loads of people that benefit from this being opaque and complex, right? I think the irony is a lot of what we're trying to do is to some degree aligned with what a payer would want, right? That all these payers have spent 15 years trying to design benefits to encourage people to go to the right provider. They've done all the possible punitive things you can imagine, whether it's step edits or prior auths or other sort of punitive ways to drive people to the right level of care for their need. And almost no one has actually built a tooling to make that visible or useful to the consumer. And so like, I actually don't think in the case of general medicine, we're misaligned with the payer. I just think it's this sort of baked belief that opacity and complexity is kind of net good for them for some ambiguous reason. And I think that's actually not not totally true at this point.
Well, we've seen alternative models like high deductible plans, QSERA, ICRA. The demand for those sort of plans increase in the recent years. But do you think there's like room for something else? Like, could general medicine be paired with some sort of like catastrophic plan for folks to just manage their spend altogether?
I mean, I think it's so healthcare that all of the innovation has happened on the plan design, and no one's built anything for that to be useful to the consumer. Like, it's like they've done so much work, in these really like wonky ways to try to change behavior. And effectively, like, it's still, other than general medicine, some of the stuff we built at Amazon, it's basically impossible to understand like what your options are and what the price is up front. So like none of the plan design matters if it's not actionable by the consumer. And so we think a lot more about how do you expose all of this, what is relatively thoughtful plan design, to the actual customer to make it actionable and to actually change behavior. And I think, again, it's very classic healthcare that everything but what was built for the consumer is trying to address these problems.
Right. I mean, let's talk about general medicine. I was browsing the website. I think it looks great. It's very straightforward, but it's also kind of hip. I almost feel like you're taking on HIMSS. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Not really. Obviously, there's some flavors of a bunch of different things in there.
Yeah.
I think that very few companies have really tried to mesh both cash and insurance, so you have very clear pricing with all the tools available to you, and tried to combine digital and offline care in a very seamless way. I would portray my perception of HIMSS as, look, we're just doing cash. We're focused on these like really simple customer experiences where we can really move the needle on like the flow. And I think that there's a lot of utility there for certain types of customers. But like, if you really unpack insurance, like imagine a world where every consumer in the US had this like coupon in their pocket that most of the things you sell, they could have for free. And you decided it wasn't worth the effort to make that easy for consumers. Like, that's just like a crazy take to me. If you sort of just, ignore the like fact that it's quote unquote insurance, like, we provide a very similar customer experience for low acuity stuff, but oftentimes it's free. If you're Medicaid, it's literally $0 to use our services. And most of that competitive set is still charging both high rates for generic drugs and other ways to monetize that I think long-term are less sustainable.
Did you have to get in network with all the payers, or how did you go about building that?
Yep. So we did all of the heavy lifting, mostly administrative. It wasn't like we were banging the door down at the payer. We were just filling out the paperwork and taking the base level rates. But yeah, we're in all 50 states. I think we're probably up to about 75 or 80% insurance coverage at this point. And obviously we're going to keep chipping away at that till it gets as close to 100 as possible. It's very similar to what we did at PillPack, right? We got a network with all the PBMs. We didn't try to go do some kind of strategic BD deal. We just signed up like every pharmacy on every street corner. And then over time, obviously, we had a number of issues and we worked through those with those PBMs. But at that point, we had proven that people wanted our services and they were utilized and we had scale and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Is it technically a marketplace then, since you're able to connect them with other providers? They're not your own providers.
I think the right way to think about it is a sort of hybrid first-party, third-party marketplace, right? The sort of obviously most successful version of that is in Amazon, where they both have their own retail footprint, and then 60, 70% of their business is the third-party marketplace. We think that's the right model here, where I think if you think about the way we're delivering care, like we do have our own first-party medical group that's in network with insurance and our own docs. I think their primary role, especially over time, is helping customers navigate things that are much more complicated and complex and like hard to figure out like what the next step even is. And once we know what that next step is, either it's relatively low acuity, can be done over telemedicine, like pretty simple, in which case we have third-party provider partners that can deliver that care, or it's very complicated or needs some in-person amount of care. And we're both giving you, imagine you need an x-ray or labs or any sort of offline service. We're showing you all the providers in your area. We're showing you your cash price and your out-of-pocket, specific to you insurance price. And you can filter and sort by that and then book the appointment. Yeah. And then we are literally booking the appointment for you and providing the referral. So you don't have to do anything. And then we'll continue to do follow-up care for you downstream. So it really is trying to use all the available tools to make that overall journey easy and not become just another kind of siloed offering that doesn't actually interact with the rest of healthcare.
Yeah. So if I have a startup that offers let's say like autism screening, virtual autism screening for a child, we can reach out to general medicine and potentially get referrals. So tell me about how you're going to work with startups and build that network.
Yeah, the ambition would be that for kind of best-in-class vertical solutions, that we are a great conduit for consumers to find out about that solution and to make that handoff elegant and easy. And I think we're in the early days of doing deeper integrations right now. We've done all of this without having to quote unquote integrate. So like all the pricing work that we've done, you can literally check with any price with any provider, any insurance. Doesn't require like us having a relationship with them. But I think over time, as you could imagine, like you'll see those relationships formalized with both startups and traditional health systems so that it's even more integrated than the current experience.
But it'll be a walled garden. It won't be.
Well, it's not really a walled garden. I mean, I think if you look at the kind of V1 of these offline booking services, one of the challenges that my perception and one of the challenges that they've had is that you have this natural selection bias to providers that have just loads of availability. And so we intentionally didn't want to require these integrations to participate in our network. We want to be able to refer you to whoever the best provider is for you. And so we didn't want these kind of artificial kind of walled garden constraints. I think if we're talking kind of novel, new companies that are building interesting experiences, like it's less about it being a walled garden and more about wanting that sort of interaction and that handoff to be seamless for the consumer.
Will you enable reviews so that you can understand the patient experience?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work to get to some semblance of a quality rating for providers as we're thinking about who to refer you to.
Yeah.
Obviously depends on what matters in that individual care episode, right? It might be about speed, it might be about quality, it might be about price. Like it just really depends on the exact interaction. But we definitely have done a bunch of work to make that quality part of the recommendation and referral flow. I think over time, we're pretty pro this looking like retail. And I think in that sense, we think reviews are net good. I think it's not just retail, so you've got to figure out the nuance of these reviews and exactly how they show up. But as you can imagine, we've spent dozens of hours debating these things as part of Amazon, and now a lot of that thinking continues forward here.
It's its own beast. How does like entrepreneurship feel the second time around?
It feels more like sport. Like I think I would just do this even if I wasn't economic. Like it's just I don't know if I'm a glutton for punishment, but it gives me a ton of energy. It's fun. I enjoy it. So like it feels
you like your co-founder to do it again with someone.
I love my co-founder. He was out on the street. We talk to each other 5 times a day. Like the first time around very much was like, we got to pull this off. It always felt existential. It was like, I don't know if it was high stress in the sense that people complain about being a founder is high stress. Like I mostly enjoyed it, but it was very different. Now all that sort of motivation has gone away. And this is really just like, I feel like we can contribute. It is literally just fun. And so it just feels very different in that sense. Like we're just doing it sort of for the love of the game more than anything.
Yeah. So I'm sure you were proud to sell PillPack to Amazon, obviously a huge outcome for the entire industry. But, I know all M&A integrations are messy. I did it, not at your scale, but I know, how hard it is to hand your baby over. Acquirers have a different point of view, a different set of priorities. You stayed there for 4 years, I believe, which I'm guessing is the entirety of your golden handcuffs.
It was, to the day.
Tell me about that experience, those 4 probably very long years.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I think there's this perception of integration, which I think is probably generally true, but the perception that the challenges come from misalignment or a difference in priorities or strategy. Like we don't have any of those issues. Like when what led us to sell to Amazon in the first place was we had gotten pretty fixated on this idea of shoppability, like generally in healthcare, which clearly that fixation remains. And we had pitched them on this vision of like a pharmacy where it was just as easy to shop as the rest of the Amazon ecosystem. Like you would assume that was sort of their vision. That was very much our vision. And like, it was more us having to convince them that this will actually work in healthcare and doesn't have to be like a different thing. And so we showed up like deeply aligned. Like the ambition was like PillPack will remain. We'll keep scaling that business for that customer set. But most of our energy is building a totally new product experience on Amazon, and we'll integrate all of our back-end fulfillment centers and software and everything into the core retail stack. So we showed up on day one like pretty deeply strategically aligned. And, I think I had, even through the full 4 years, like there's a lot of like rigmarole and like a lot of process, but I don't think we were ever at odds on the prioritization, the level of investment, the strategy. Like that stuff was all actually really good. I think what happened was that we were so fixated on becoming part of Amazon, which I think again was the right strategy for the business, that you pick your head up like 2 to 3 years into that journey and you realize you've just like the thing you built has been completely co-opted culturally. And again, like I think that's probably for the best. Like I think that is like success for an integration, and I don't regret any of those decisions, but it very much became Amazon, and there's like an enormous amount of process, an enormous amount of kind of cruft. Like I'd probably spent 40% of my life on HR stuff, which was like 2%.
40%.
Swear to God, like that's not an anomalous thing. Any VP at Amazon, that's the reality of their life. Wow. And so just sort of like you pick your head up and you're like, this just wasn't that much fun anymore. Like I'm just part of a big machine. But like I actually think we made all of the right integration decisions. The strategy was correct. It was never contemplated like what that meant for me personally until at some point you're like, all right, this thing is just like a totally different thing and I'm ready to move on.
Do they keep the PillPack brand?
Yeah. And our vision was always, even if we would sit independent, we would have done the same thing, which is over time, PillPack needs to morph to a product brand, not like a platform brand, right? It's very like product centric. It's very specific to one subset of the overall opportunity. And so what the brand evolved to eventually was PillPack by Amazon Pharmacy. So Amazon Pharmacy is like the whole infrastructure, kind of the right analogy is, now I can't even remember it, whatever like the recurrence thing is on Amazon, but it remains as a product brand, and then Amazon Pharmacy is the actual pharmacy brand.
Yeah. And
subscribe and save. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
But do you feel like the PillPack kind of being separate and not core to Amazon, do you feel like that they invested less in that brand because it's not a core Amazon experience?
They just actually relaunched like a much more fully featured version of PillPack last week on Amazon. And they've done a bunch of work to make it an even better onboarding experience. Like I think one of the benefits of having both the traditional line of business and the PillPack line of business is you can make that switch much more seamless, right? So you already have all these prescriptions in your profile. You can sync them and put them into PillPacks in like one step versus having to kind of munge together the transfer, get everything over, and then put it in packs like all in one go. So they're not investing in PillPack. And honestly, like if there's anyone to blame for investment levels, it's me. I was at the call face of that, and I thought that the big opportunity was to build the new thing. So people always think I must be frustrated by it, and I'm like, well, if I am, I should be frustrated with myself because that was largely my decision.
So one of the big promises of PillPack was just simplification, and that obviously moving the needle on cost, access, adherence. Where do you feel like that product succeeded systemically, and where do you feel like you hit a wall?
I mean, I think it succeeded in the sense that we did everything in our power to deliver on the customer experience we promised. And like, I think most things in healthcare, we built the sort of most elegant front end possible. So like from day one, when the customer signed up, it felt very simple and easy. And then on day one behind the scenes, there was no systems. Like there was spreadsheets and a lot of people and like complicated operations. And, I think if you think about what the PillPack offer was, like, yes, it was the packaging, like that was like the easy thing to market, but it was like all the things that went into that packaging working, right? Like if you have 7 different prescriptions and we miss a refill on one of them, or one of them has a prior auth and gets held up and we can't dispense it, like the product is useless. Like you have to get all 7 scripts shipped together at the same time every month. And so I think that just forced us to do all this operational work. And I think I'm super proud of like what we were able to deliver for customers when it comes to that product. I think we hit a natural ceiling of efficiently being able to acquire that demographic, right? It's a much smaller subset of the market than what's now available on Amazon. And I think we were starting to feel like there was a lot of opportunity to go broader. I think one thing people don't really know about PillPack was that by the time we left, we had really 3 kind of discrete businesses. We had the PillPack business everyone's familiar with, or most people are familiar with the packaging. We obviously had the Amazon Pharmacy business, but we also had this B2B business that was basically a fulfillment business for pharma and payers to be able to build novel kind of customer experiences on top of our infrastructure, kind of the first generation of D2C pharma. And actually, when I left, that was twice as large as any of our other businesses. It was twice as big as the Amazon pharmacy business. It was twice the size of PillPack. It went from something like 0 to 600 million in top line in 4 years or something. Like that business was really successful. But again, you couldn't have built that business without having started with PillPack. Like you had to build something novel for consumers to even get access to the market. So
did you guys ever do any studies or have any insight into the outcomes from people using the product?
Yeah, what the ecosystem cares about is percent days covered, basically like what your cadence of refills are. That's what drives star ratings. That's what drives reimbursement. That's like the sort of metric that all of the PBMs, payers, and other constituents care about. On that metric, given the nature of our service, we were significantly better than even pharmacies only doing 90-day supplies, which if you just think about it, we have 3 times the opportunity to fail because we're filling every month and our product required that. And we were still superseding the companies that were just doing 90-day supplies. So on the metric that the market cares about, we were quite good, and that ultimately drove volume over time. On like second order outcomes, we never did the sort of studies to prove or not prove that someone with heart failure was healthier or someone with diabetes was healthier, partially because cynically, like no one actually cares about that. That doesn't actually drive incremental reimbursement. So we sort of focus on the things that that the market rewards. Mostly just marketing to consumers.
Tell me the story about the PBMs and the fun time you had working with them.
Yes, it was a great time. I mentioned this earlier, but like in the very earliest days, we just got a network like Joe's Pharmacy on Main Street, right? We filled out all the paperwork. I got in all the networks. We started dispensing meds. Like it's what my dad had done. It's what we'd done growing up. Like I knew how to do that. And that was fine for 2 years, something like that, maybe from 2013 to 2015. And then in a matter of maybe 6 months, we went from 20 million in top line to 100 million in top line. Like the thing was just cranking. And all of a sudden, all the PBMs like, wait, what is this PillPack thing? Like, why are there claims? Why are the claims going up exponentially?
You got on someone's desk.
Like, I've never heard of this. And in a matter of 9 months, there's basically 3 PBMs that matter. You have Optum, CVS, and Express Scripts. In the matter of 9 months, every one of them tried to terminate us from their network, so their members couldn't use our services.
Why? Because they had their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately PBMs basically had a captive market in mail order for 2 decades, right? There was no one else could participate in that market. And it's the primary reason that e-commerce and pharmacy didn't just track to other categories. Like there is no other reason that pharmacy shouldn't be at similar segment share to CPG or other retail categories, right? It's predictable. It's mostly commodity. It's easy to mail. Like all of the things that would drive e-commerce adoption are there. But the PBMs kept anyone doing kind of e-commerce out of their networks. And of course, we were kind of young and dumb and naive, and like this wasn't contemplated when we started the company. We're just like going to build something better. We're going to get a network like everybody else, and it's going to be fine. So anyway, we had Caremark, I think, was the first to hit us with a termination notice. So it gave us like 45 days to sort it out. I got an advisor involved that helped me as sort of like a political type. And ultimately, we got them at bay, and they kind of went away, and it was all copacetic. Optum, we had a bunch of back and forth because it's kind of maybe 3 months later, we came to some resolution with them, but it was kind of dicey. And then Express Scripts hit us with a termination notice. I think we had 2 weeks before we were going to lose the totality of their business. At the time, they were far and away the largest PBM. It was 40% of our revenue. And we had basically 2 weeks like gun to our head that like, all these customers are not going to be able to use your services. And, we made the tough decision to just go to war with them very publicly. We built this campaign on fixpharmacy.com, and we had more than 2,000 customer testimonials in 24 hours of what was going to happen to these folks if they lost access. And it wasn't like, oh, the packaging is so cool, like this company's so hip, like I don't want to lose PillPack. It was like if we lose access to these services, my mom's going to have to get put in a nursing home. Like we really can't afford that right now. Or like my parents live halfway across the country, and this is the only way I've been able to keep them out of the hospital. Like it was real, tangible stuff. It wasn't like this kind of kitschy startup thing. And so we launched that website. We had something like 30 news articles in the first day. We had half a dozen senators call, a dozen congressmen, CMS, HHS, just kind of full court press. sort of pushing them on like, what is the rationale here? Like there can't be a rationale that's beyond just anti-competitive and not wanting other pharmacies in your network. And there's a lot more to the story, but the net of it is with it prior to that 2-week window, we got a new contract. We resolved everything with Express Scripts. And I think that was the moment when it went from like this deep existential risk to the business to like, they kind of shot their shot. Like they might be able to attack these guys in more nuanced ways. And obviously everyone did that, but they're here to stay. They're going to be a participant. Like we got to figure out other ways to try to compete with them. It was definitely like the penultimate moment for the business.
Yeah. I love that a consumer-oriented startup had a consumer-oriented response to the fight. Like you could have just gone behind the scenes and made calls and called up the FTC and complained about anti-competitiveness, but you kind of took the same approach that you took to building the company.
Totally. And I think it was sort of multifaceted, right? If you were a regulator and you ended up on that site, like we did have all these resources for you, whether it was showing the impact that we made to adherence or the policy changes that we think would help with this sort of issue. So like we addressed the different constituents, but it was 100% customer led. And I think it's part of why I believe that if you build something actually great for customers, it is the best way to ensure durability and to actually build something that matters.
Were PBMs ever a potential acquirer for PillPack?
Not really. They kicked tires over the years, but I think tangibly, no. The relationship did evolve and change post Amazon. Like we were able to reset most of those relationships. And at this point, they're somewhere around neutral. Like I still talk to some of the folks on the PBM side that we interacted with over the years. And we sort of went through that entire arc of a healthcare business from like, no one cares about you to like antagonist to like long-term, everyone's just a frenemy in the ecosystem. So we kind of ended up in the ultimate place.
The faster you can land there, the better.
Exactly.
PBMs have been in the spotlight lately since the FTC came out with that report last year. Where do you think they're going to land in like 5-10 years? Do you feel like this is a sustainable, now like we have Sarah Huckabee Sanders talking about them, and it's kind of becoming something that common folks are more aware of. So where do you think that's going to go?
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical that there'll be a regulatory intervention that matters. But I am also optimistic that a new approach to managing costs will show up. And so I think the PBMs are everyone's favorite punching bag for obvious reasons, and I think it's largely fair. But there are very few folks that have a clear vision of what actually could replace a PBM and be more effective than the current approach. And that's what I think is actually the most interesting. Like I think and this is obviously the thrust of a lot of the work that we did at Amazon was, how do we move this from like a backdoor once-a-year negotiation between a PBM and pharma to like an ongoing retail category where consumers are in the loop, consumers are making purchase decisions, those purchase decisions manage costs naturally versus needing these mechanisms like rebates and other, formulary and all that other stuff. And if you unpack what a PBM really is, it's sort of like an old school marketplace. It's an old school digital like demand aggregator, but the consumer is not a constituent really in that flow. And so I think until you move that kind of negotiation to like a shopping moment, like no one has come up with a solution that's better than the PBM. And so no matter how much they try to punitively regulate them, you can't just build like the next version without actually building the next version. You're not going to regulate your way there, in my opinion.
Yeah. You don't think health plans could negotiate, or what if there was just regulation around like there's a set price and the ultimate price that patients pay or health plans pay is like within a band? Like we created more consistency in pricing.
Yeah. So obviously you could have Medicare negotiate these prices like writ large, and that would look a lot more like the medical benefit. And all of a sudden, like the need for a PBM is quite mitigated. I think that's a tractable approach. We're sort of in the worst of all worlds right now, where there's both negotiating an aggregate discount and like a small handful of drugs that changes every year, which is like just a terrible solution. But I do think that is a tractable approach. I think if you unpack the new EO on drug pricing, there's a specific angle there that I think is interesting, where if you force pharma to have comparable list prices to other countries versus caring about net per se, you'd have things like Wegovy go from $1,000 a month to $250 overnight, and pharma actually wouldn't be charging any less. You just get rid of all of the rebate flow and like the stuff that's impossible to unpack. So like I think if you did either of those things, like ultimately the PBM is much less relevant. So I'm probably optimistic about stuff like that. But I do think like in a world where, let's say you just do the list price thing, right? And you get to comparable list prices to other countries, and all of a sudden like people can actually shop the category. That's what I think is interesting, because then you can move this to the consumer and away from the ultimate payer, unless that it's like the end goal in and of itself. It's just like a mechanism to get to clearer pricing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously we haven't talked about pharma and their point of view as a stakeholder, but from your experience working in the industry, how do they view PBMs?
I think for a long time, it was a very symbiotic relationship. It used to be a much more fragmented market, right? There was hundreds of PBMs that were very regional. Having a mechanism like rebates where you still have all the leverage and you can give differentiated pricing to each different PBM based on volume and other qualifiers was like net good for pharma. And I think as the industry consolidated, you end up with 3 PBMs, the leverage flipped, right? Pharma used to have the leverage when it was not consolidated. All of a sudden it's consolidated. And the PBMs do have the leverage. They keep chipping away at, like, net price has gone down for the last 5 years. It's not going up. And so I think at this point, it's largely an antagonistic relationship. At the same time, I don't think there's the appetite to totally like walk away from the current supply chain. That there is a bunch of goodness that comes from it for pharma. And so I think it sort of trended negative over time, but I think they're just as much to blame around what got us here as the PBMs are.
Sure. So
it's like everything in healthcare. Everyone was playing the game, and all of a sudden
everybody's
like,
pointing fingers.
This game isn't as useful for me as it was 10 years ago. I don't like it anymore.
For our last question, I like to ask all of our guests, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about our healthcare system, what would it be?
I would find a mechanism to elongate the relationship between a consumer and their payer. I think nearly everything that's problematic about the current incentive set comes down to that one issue. And there are lots of like different ways to do that. But until you solve that problem, like, you're going to have most of the same issues that we have today.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, TJ, it was great seeing you. Thanks for being here today.
Likewise. Good to chat.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Hallie Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Krause, and Hallie Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.